Welcome to our webinar. We are going to be talking to you today about building family and organization archives at permanent.org. I'm so excited that we'll be talking to Rachael Cristine Woody today. She's a professional archivist consultant with Rachael Cristine Consulting. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about her in a minute, but first I'd love to share with you the exciting things we're doing at Permanent Legacy Foundation. So, I am Amberly. Like I said, I am also a professional archivist. I have a master's in archives from the University of Texas at Austin, Hook 'em Horns. And I also have a master's in literature from Texas State University. I've been fortunate enough to work with some incredible archives at Texas State University, including the Texas Music Collection at the Whitliff. It was an amazing experience, and having that experience as an intern is what led me to have a love for archives. So when I joined Permanent, I knew that I was in the right place. Permanent is a place where you can create, curate, and collaborate on living archives for yourself, your family, and your community. It is free to sign up, and also you can get started with a free gigabyte at permanent.org. So what is preservation services? As I told you, I'm a preservation services manager here, and we are going to very soon be rolling out services to help you build your family archives online at permanent.org. You can build your family archives, or you can build your organization archives there, and that is something that Rachael Cristine Woody will be talking to you about in a moment. Some of the products and services we're going to be helping people with are consultations to find out how you want to build your family archive online, and the lasting legacy, how you want your lasting legacy to be handed down from generation to generation on our platform at permanent.org. We're going to help you with digitization. So I've been helping someone who has photos from the late 1800s on up to the 90s right now. It is a large collection, and it is so amazing to get to work with all of those materials. Sometimes those things can be overwhelming, and Rachael's going to also be talking to you about ways to help with overwhelm. Also, we'll help you organize your archives online by updating the metadata or all of the descriptions that you have for your photos. And this is just an example of what that will look like, and Rachael will be going further into that in a moment. So with these services, we are offering to put people on a wait list in order to get a discount for the initial rollout of these services next year. You can get on the wait list by emailing me directly, amberly@permanent.org. I welcome you to email me anytime if you have any questions about our platform. Also, we have an incredible knowledge base with lots of helpful tools on how to get started. And our user experience team is incredible. And I am also really proud of all of the things our engineers do at Permanent Legacy Foundation. They're amazing people, and our leadership is amazing. So without further ado, Rachael, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks, Amberly. How are you?
Good, good. Well, Rachael Cristine Woody is the owner of Rachael Cristine Consulting LLC, a firm that provides services to archives, museums, and cultural heritage organizations. Rachael specializes in establishing emerging collection programs, assessment and planning for historical collections, and implementing digital collection platforms. In other words, she's awesome. Previously, she revived collection programs at the Smithsonian Institution and launched the Oregon Wine History Archive at Linfield University. She received her Master of Science in Library and Information Science with a concentration in archives management, and I am so happy to welcome Rachael to this webinar.
Thank you so much for the warm introduction, Amberly, and thank you to Permanent for hosting this particular topic that's near and dear to all of our hearts. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that you can see some of the stuff I have been working on. All right, Amberly, can everybody see my screen okay? Perfect. All right, let's get into it. So we're focusing on family archiving, but knowing that we do have small historical organizations, archives, and museums that could also be interested in using this product. I am going to cover both sides since there are many similarities between family archiving and small organization archiving. So I'm going to focus on one of my clients in particular to help explain and share how I've been using permanent for the client projects that I'm working on. And so this particular one is the story of the Pinson, Tarrant, and the Tuanilani archive. And thanks again to Permanent Foundation for asking me to be here and for hosting this really interesting conversation. Just a note of housekeeping before we get into this, especially as it is a live webinar. Remain muted, at least through the duration of the presentation. There is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So as questions come up in your mind, please use the Q&A box versus the chat to log your question in. That way we can make sure that we answer it and it doesn't accidentally get lost in the chat history there. And then we do plan on having at least a 15-minute Q&A session at the end to help answer any of the questions that you have either for myself or for the permanent team. Amberly already did such a great introduction for myself. So I think the only thing that I would add in addition to my professional work is in this particular picture, you see that I'm wearing a shirt that says great granddaughter of an immigrant. And that's sort of an introduction into, for the project that we're highlighting today, the Tuanilani Archives. It is actually a collection that is connected to me and my much larger Samoan family. And so for me, we all share the common ancestor of my great grandmother from Samoa. And so that's why this particular shirt and picture is relevant to the conversation and is a connection to one of the projects that not only ended up being a client project, but also a project very much tied to me and my own family history. So, what we're going to cover today is the challenges that face family and small archives, some of which are different, but there are, of course, many similarities. And then I do have strategies for each, whether you're here for family archives or if you're here for an archives organization. We do have some strategies that I want to share with you to think about and implement as it makes sense for you to help get your project going and sustainable. I am going to talk about digital platforms a bit in general and how having a digital platform can help you manage and share, whether it's your family collection or archives collection. And then I am going to get into why I chose permanent specifically for a couple of my client projects. I've had the pleasure of working with the permanent platform over the last few years, and it's been really exciting to see how they've evolved their product to provide service to family archives, which are critical to be captured and saved at the individual levels, but also for those archives that are just not large enough to warrant having a different sort of collections management system, and how Permanent's doing a really great job sort of bridging that gap and meeting that need. So let's get into family archives. This particular picture I love on the what is my left-hand side looking at it. There's the little girl in the blue dress. That is my mother, Rebecca Rose. And in this particular archive for the Tuanilani archive, it's a 4-generation archive. And so the photos that were captured and shared in this particular project spans 4 generations, following the maternal line, which is traditionally for Samoa is the way that family lineage and history is typically handed down and tracked. So that's why I wanted to point out my mom in that blue dress. So for family archives challenges, and of course as a professional archivist and also as a member of a family, I have definitely experienced both family archive challenges and regular archive challenges. For the family ones specifically, the challenges that are present for many are that the family heirlooms are dispersed and that nobody knows who has what. Especially for this particular client example, the family had gotten so big and so spread out across Samoa, much of the Pacific Northwest, and across the United States to the East Coast, that when you're chronicling 4 generations worth of family, especially some who had immigrated, nobody really knows at that point who has what. And there's that risk of loss just through that disbursement. Also, many of these photographs are one of a kind. We don't have the photo negatives. In this particular case, many of the photographs were Polaroids as well. So it's the negative and the photograph in one. There's only one copy. And between disbursement and only having one copy of all of these things, the risk for permanent loss or damage to these materials is extremely high. And then with disbursement, with spanning multiple generations for family archives, the knowledge of the people, places, events being captured in these photographs may be at this point lost and unknown. And so there's that information loss as well as the item loss that we're struggling with. Then, of course, when you're dealing with family archive, there are multiple family members involved, and not every family member or every family has like a tech savvy person, let alone a trained archivist. And that can be a real knowledge and access gap for people with valuable family archives. And the fact that it takes time, care, consistency to digitize and describe these family items. And so all of those things together, it can be a very overwhelming thing to contemplate digitizing and sharing your family archives online. So some of the strategies that I've used and have shared with clients, whether they're an archival organization or if they're working on a family archive, is to put out a call and inventory who has what. Doing essentially a survey of materials to see where some of those collection pockets ended up and who is interested in sort of pulling those together. Then, of course, being able to digitize the materials to aid in the preservation and sharing will help immensely in terms of helping to mitigate the loss of the items and the information, and also being able to share them unlimitedly because they are digital. Then there are options to work with a consultant or a digitization vendor wherever area you may need more support around. You don't necessarily have to do everything yourself. There are experts out there who can help if you don't have time, etc., to do those on your own, acquire the equipment, etc. Also, consider crowdsourcing information with a show and tell feature. So I know in working with several of the family archives, sharing photographs on a platform like Facebook or Instagram or Pinterest and engaging with your family members and sharing with your extended family what you have so far and asking for help to fill in those informational gaps. And then I encourage you to set up a system that works for you, whether it is scheduling in like a once a month pace for scanning a few photos or describing a few photos at a time, or if you prefer to do like intensive batch processing, which is typically how I work best, where you are in it and focused on the particular project for hours, if not days at a time, to sort of economize your efficiency. So find out what sort of pace and working style works for you best when you're working on these type of projects. Now, shifting to the smaller archives perspective and the challenges that may be unique to them, first and foremost is that there's typically little to no budget for these types of organizations to not only acquire a collections management system or a digital asset management system, but let alone any sort of annual costs that have now become very common for subscription services or software as a service. Also, especially in the case of my other client, Astoria Public Library, they are a public institution and there's the reasonable expectation that it is their responsibility to serve the collections to the public. But how can you do that when you have the next bullet point of challenges, limited staff time and heavy dependency on volunteers, in addition to the limited budget? So there's some real constraints here and challenges that are complicating and creating more challenges. Also, when you are working with archives, there are best practices and standards in place, not only for how we digitize and preserve those files, but also in how we describe them and how we can make them engaging for the community. And then there's that overall user expectation that any of the items that you have digitized and put online, that those items be Googleable for many of the general community, and even for many of, like in this case, like city council, the mayor, etc. There's that expectation that if the library is digitizing and putting things online, that they're automatically easily findable and that they should be Googleable. So these are some of the challenges that an archives organization is facing when they're considering projects like this. So some strategies for these particular types of institutions. Some of the strategies I recommend are considering how you can bring in funding, especially if you can help cover some of those one-time costs associated with acquiring digitization equipment, as well as acquiring and setting up either a collections management system and or a digital asset management system. Then choose a collections management system, or CMS in Archivist lingo, to include the ability to publish online. For many products at this point, they are at least offering some form of being able to publish online, and some are better than others. But it is now becoming a user expectation from your stakeholders that these items be published online, and that that is part of how you are serving your users and your stakeholders. So we have to have that ability not only to put it into a CMS, but that CMS will then publish it online. Also, we need to identify and follow best practices as they pertain to your particular institution. And so an example of this would be following the Society of American Archivists describing archives a content standard, or acronym is DACS, DACS. And DACS is a manual that provides all sorts of ways to describe or how to describe your types of collection materials, and can help you work through that practice and choose which best practices make sense for your collection and your institution. Then set up a digitization workflow and data entry template. That way, what you're setting up can help be foolproof. You're setting up some consistency, both in terms of what sort of data you're capturing or how you are digitizing, what sort of resolution standards you're using. It can also be helpful that if you have an established workflow and instructions, that if you're relying on volunteers or interns or what have you, that there's some training and some visual directions that they can reference when they're working within the particular system. So I do want to take a moment and talk about how the right digital platform can support your archive, whether it's a family archive or a traditional archives organization. And so regardless of platform name, regardless of what sort of product you choose, these are the sort of items that I would recommend be like the core functionality that you look for when you're looking at choosing a system. The first one is that you need that system to be able to digitize and then centrally store your digital files. They all need to be in one place, and you need the ability to manage and organize them in a way that makes sense for either your family or your organization. Also, you need whichever product system that is, you need it to have mechanisms in place that protect files from loss or corruption. And to be more specific about that, we're talking about the digital files now. Now that you've digitized your items, we still need to make sure that those digital files are preserved so that you don't lose them and then lose all of that work that you did and lose that digital surrogate to those one-of-a-kind collections. You also, in whichever product you choose, it needs to have the ability not only to store the digital files, it's not just like a USB drive. you need to be able to assign data to each of those files. So whether that is basic metadata from the photograph being taken that you're interested in, and or the actual descriptive data that for my clients are is more important for them and what they're more interested in. Regardless of the data that you're interested in, obviously you need a way to be able to attach that data to each of your digital files. And in this particular photo, you can see the example of that. You have the photo on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side is where both my descriptive and photo data is living. Also, in whatever product you choose, especially if you want to provide access to beyond yourself, so whether it's to your extended family or to throughout your organization, you need to be able to assign a user level role and control who has access to what. And I would even say to be able to delineate different types of users. Then, of course, and in the archives world, this isn't too much of an issue, but I do want to state you should have and be able to retain the rights to your material. In the archives field, if you're choosing an archive associated product, that typically is not an issue, but just in case you're doing a broader shop, I just want to mention that you do need to be careful and pay attention to who owns those materials. And then, of course, that product typically needs to be able to publish and share your materials online so that you can facilitate either that family or that archives community access. So let's talk about two of my clients specifically. We're going to start with the Pinson Tarrant Tuanilani archive. And this is a screenshot of how the public-facing side of this archive is presented. There are a few different presentation styles you can choose from the permanent platform specifically. And this particular one is what I informally call sort of the Insta style display, where you've got these beautiful uniform square thumbnails of the images that are present. The link down here, the bit.ly link, is where you can go check out that public archive on your own if you want to do some digging and click around to see what sort of metadata and things we've included for our entries. And for these, this was, I chose to display them this way because the photographs themselves are so compelling. There's such a rich storytelling through these photos, especially as you scroll through the 4 generations worth of photographs. And so this particular presentation I felt was a really good one for this type of archive. It is worth noting, though, another very popular style and one that one of my other clients has used is the timeline presentation, where you can have whatever photographs or documents displayed via a timeline model. So let's get into some details. So why I chose permanent for this particular client project is that it doesn't require archival knowledge specifically or any sort of database experience to be able to use permanent.org successfully. And knowing that while I was establishing the archive for this family client to begin with, I need it and want it to be sustainable for the family to be able to maintain on their own. And that is critically important if it's more than just you using the platform. Also, this platform supports tagging and geolocation. Given the immigration story of how my great-grandmother came from Samoa to initially San Diego and then the family growing from there, having the ability to geo-tag the photographs of Samoa and then as they traveled and migrated through the United States was critical to telling this particular family story. And so being able to see on this right-hand side and so easily assign a geolocation, whether it was to a city or to a very specific house address, you can do either and have it show up in that cool little map feature. Another thing that was important in this area is being able to tag both people, places, and events, and having tags established for the family members, knowing that there are 4 generations worth, was critically important for this project. Also, for this type of collection, offering that beautiful, as I said, that Insta style display and the ability to switch to the timeline display is very important and is a feature that I have found my clients appreciate the most, is the presentation style and having it be just very easily engaging. Also, for permanent, it doesn't require a permanent account for you to view. So if you have things published online, there's that public access. You can also share, if you don't have your items online, you can still share them through the permanent platform by using a tool on the back end. Also, the rights are retained by you. So remember, I highlighted and underlined to make sure that whatever product you choose, that's the case, and that the family can join at no cost to help contribute towards the project. So for permanent.org, the cost involved is one time. And then if you need more storage, you can buy more storage one time if you need it. But you don't actually need to pay for accounts or to invite people to help contribute any sort of descriptive data. It's really just down to tracking the file sizes of the files you contribute. And so when you're working with family archives and you're working with multiple people within that family, having that ability to give permanent accounts to those family members without having to add additional costs to the project was definitely important for this particular client project. Then, of course, the ability to support downloading, and that is available both on the back end and front end. So it's not dependent on it being public. You can still offer downloading to specific family members. And that, of course, was critical for this project. And then, of course, it's permanent, which, is a play on the name, of course, for this product. But knowing that permanent.org has a very robust digital preservation machine on the back end is definitely helpful in me as a professional and also for family members to have confidence in a product that is not going to go away anytime soon. So to continue with this archive, I did want to walk you through my process for this family archive client, as it may be helpful to provide insight to you who are looking at starting your own family archive projects. The first step, of course, was getting the images digitized. So having them sort of coalesced and digitized, of which I did the bulk of, but now can, of course, be added to by family members. We then went through and did some massive metadata creation. We chose to do that in a spreadsheet form, which is typically what I recommend for everyone, family archive or traditional archive. And that way you can capture all of the data at once, especially as the photographs will typically interrelate together. And that way you can make sure you're providing similar and related metadata. And then reviewing those photos with the client for further identification. So even though I had somewhat of a familial connection to this project, I, of course, only know my one little corner of that family. And so connecting with other family members and asking and being able to capture the names, dates, events, places throughout those 4 generations was incredibly helpful. We then were able to batch upload the photographs into permanent. Very easy drag and drop. So that, of course, makes your job easier. At the moment, we can't do the batch uploading of the data, but if you are doing them in a spreadsheet first, you can do a very easy copy paste transfer of the data into the fields you're using. I do recommend establishing tags for consistency, and even for this collection, using the people tags, how we identify those people and doing so consistently will help provide better search access. Because when you don't have consistency, or if you're not using tags, then you're very severely limiting getting any sort of accurate search results back. Also, for the women's names specifically, because we went through 4 generations, there's obviously some name changes that happen, particularly with their surnames. And given the maternal alignment of the Samoan culture, we decided to put an emphasis on their maiden names, which is why the maiden names are captured through those 3 top generations of the collection. And we also decided to treat both women and men's names as a first middle name assignment. That way, when at least the women's surnames changed, they could still be identified with that first and middle name. Also, there were different surname spelling variations, particularly once we got to that top fourth generation tier with the Tuanelani surname. There are at least four different spellings of that name for several reasons. For the Samoan culture, there was not that 26 letter alphabet. And then, of course, as cultures immigrate, different surname changes, etc. So there were at least five different records we had for this family's name that we had to sort of filter and decide which one we were using. And again, consistency is key. So for family archives, if that's the case for you too, having those discussions and figuring that out ahead of time will help you be more consistent in the sort of metadata that you're adding. Then, after all of that work was done, we were able to publish the archive to the public. At that point, we were able to invite additional family members that if they were interested, they could contribute their photos, they could contribute data or what they knew of what was captured in the photo. And so that for me is when it gets to the really fun and rewarding part of this work. It was a treat to get to that point with this project. And of course, then, I was able to hand it off to the client. They have a system in place. They have, I think, more than 500 photographs now in this particular archive. And they're able to view, use, display, enjoy, share as much as they want. So, switching to a more traditional archive side and looking at the Astoria Public Library archives. And again, there's a bit.ly link down here for you all if you want to check out the Astoria Library Archive, the public side so far online. We can use this one as an example, and I'll get into the strategies and process for how I did and approached this project. So let's get into this one. Why I chose permanent specifically for this particular client, again, it was easy to use. And as I shared with you earlier, Astoria Public Library is a fairly small shop. Astoria is the oldest settlement community on the West Coast, but it's still a small town and small town resources, therefore. So there's not a lot of money, particularly when we're working with the public library. And then while there is some IT support from the city, the library itself does not have dedicated IT support, certainly not enough to be able to have the IT person focus and implement a DAMS or a CMS for them. With those things in mind, we needed a product that was going to be financially sustainable. For Astoria Public Library, they were able to get an Institute of Museum and Library Science grant, an IMLS grant, to help pay for some of those one-time costs of searching and selecting and implementing a system. That is partly why I was able to work with them, was thanks to the IMLS grant. But knowing that the grant is only a short-term financial solution, we needed to somehow find a product that they could either not have to worry about paying for every year, or that was cheap enough where they could afford that with their limited budget. Then, of course, it's an archives. There's best practices we need to follow. Also, because it's IMLS funded, they, as the granting agency, have requirements that we follow to make sure that we're following archives best practices, both in terms of digital preservation, but also in terms of the metadata descriptions. So next up, of course, we needed a product that could do and capture that descriptive metadata for us. Having the user level controls and at a granular level will be critical for them, especially as they have more volunteers working with the system. And for this particular project, Permanent's connection and ability to easily upload to the Internet Archive was extremely attractive to the public library because they have some peer museums in Astoria that are already on Internet Archive, and it's a way for them to eventually pull their collections together to be searchable. Then Permanent it does support downloads. So people who are interested in accessing and getting a copy of these records can. And of course, it's permanent, which is critical, whether it's a family archive or a traditional archive. Having confidence in a platform that is not going to go away itself and also follow digital preservation standards is extremely important. So here's some of the process that I went through with the Astoria Public Library. We first took the grant requirements as dictated from IMLS as the granting agency, which these digital preservation requirements I actually took to permanent.org and a few others to sit down and say, okay, of these standards, which ones do you meet? Are there solutions to how we could meet them if you don't currently? And for my work in that, permanent.org was definitely the one that met the most digital preservation standards, and being able to like easily check that box for the granting agency made my job and this project a lot easier. Also, what helped with this project, especially during COVID times, was that Astoria had a volunteer who had already spent several years digitizing hundreds of materials from the collection. So we were able to jump in more quickly to recording that metadata in a spreadsheet form and working in this case with the city historian to provide not only the data and description as I see it as an archivist, but also provide that additional historical context that may not be obvious from my perspective seeing the photo, but is obvious and important from the historian's perspective. So we were able to get some really rich metadata captured for this project. We then reviewed items with the client for any sort of further identification, so with the library director and the city historian. Once everything was good with the descriptive stuff, we were able to batch upload the photos into permanent. And when you're dealing with hundreds of photos, it is really nice to be able to do that. And similarly with the previous client project, copy paste the metadata into the entries. As a note, we did have to establish some tags for data that's not currently has a field yet. For example, I believe in the platform still there's not a creator field, which is a requirement for archivists. So working with permanent.org, we do have an interim solution in place to capture it as a tag for now and then be able to parse those pieces of data into their own fields once they're available. Then we published the archive to the public. We still have a huge, I think 250 photo last batch to do. It should be done in the next month. And then we hope to use permanent and the collection on permanent for future collaboration with those other museum partners and taking advantage of that connection to Internet Archives. So to summarize, using those two different examples, and regardless of if you're working on a family archive or a traditional archive, there are some steps that you can take and apply to your own project. The first step is assess. So what is the project scope? Who is a part of your team? What is it that you need in terms of equipment, software, information, that kind of thing? And then, of course, what are the costs involved and what is the budget that you have? Next step, research. Research the type of equipment that makes sense for you. Specifically with scanners, it's going to be dependent on your type of materials. And then, of course, what sort of platform makes sense for you? Whether it's permanent or another platform, I definitely encourage you to do your homework and compare platforms to pick one that makes sense for your project, both now and in the future. Next up, gather your items, gather those tools that you need, especially if you're traditional archives, gather whatever sort of standards you're going to be following for your description and information capturing, and get to work with digitizing, whether it's a do-it-yourself approach or if you're working with a consultant or a vendor. Getting the items digitized is going to be the next huge step before you can get things online. As you're digitizing, I recommend starting to do that identification process, whether or not you know all of the information, especially for the family archive project that I worked on. I would capture the data as I saw or as I knew it, and then I had a basis to work on to then capture that additional detail. Then do some research, do some crowdsourcing, whether you have access to a city historian or family members to get more information. Describe when you're looking at these photos, a rich description is going to answer the who, what, when, where, why questions. You may not be able to answer all of them every time, but providing that information that is both obvious and not obvious from those items makes them even more valuable, not just in terms of visual appeal, but now, of course, having that rich description and historical context with it. Processing, I recommend you think about what sort of process you want to put in place, whether it's that intensive batch processing days at a time, or whether you're spreading it out periodically, whichever works for you and gets the job done. I also recommend establishing a template, whether it's just yourself or not, having that template and being able to consistently capture the data and compare it, especially in spreadsheet format, is going to save you a lot of time and heartache. Standardize whether it's the data fields you're using and how, and or creating that list of tags for people and subjects, for example. Having those determined and thought out ahead of time is very helpful. And then, of course, the fun part, the sharing part, from whichever platform you choose, hopefully you have the ability to publish those online and be able to share them, whether it's with the family or with your community as an archives. So that was the show, so to speak. I believe we have a good at least 15 minutes for questions. So
We do. That was so amazing. Thank you so much, Rachel. I learned a lot from you today, and I'm sure everyone out there did too. I'm especially happy to hear about how families and organizations and professional archivists such as yourself are interacting with our platform at permanent.org. We're going to open this up for Q&A. We encourage you to put your Q&A questions in the Q&A section so we can get to those. But to kick it off, I just wanted to say I have a question about metadata because you talked about that a lot. And metadata, for anyone who's not a professional archivist out there and is just interested in genealogy and family history, it's just the description of the photograph, places, locations, and all of that. It's a fancy word for that. When I
yes.
first went into school, I was like, what is metadata? But I wanted to ask you, oh, and speaking of metadata, just real quick, we are involved in a webinar on October 20th. And I'm going to put the link in there. It is
Hmm.
a webinar called Family History Metadata Working Group webinar, and it'll go more into that. So I'm going to drop the link for that. And I have a question about when you helped the many generations and you had your spreadsheet and you were having to kind of go back and forth. What was that process like? And also, are there templates out there or resources for doing stuff like that?
The Society of American Archivists is a good first stop to find that sort of support, specifically the DAX manual that I mentioned, the Describing Archives, a Content Standard. You can download a free e-copy, essentially, of that book. But as I mentioned, it also it gives you all of the information, and so it can be a bit overwhelming if you're newer to this type of project. I've not seen templates out there that, at least that I am super happy with. But I do tend to create those templates for my clients to use, and they are fairly straightforward. I mean, it's essentially taking what the required and like highly recommended elements are from DAX and just putting them as headers into the spreadsheet and then giving them an example of what is good standard content or data and how the best practices say to enter that data for consistency's sake. So yes, I wish there was a like go here for this great template, but it is also fairly easy-ish to create yourself once you get a little familiar. Oh, Amberly, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. We have another question. I appreciate you answering the metadata question. This one wants to know for you, Rachel, for the family archive was getting permission from family members an issue? Were there some who did not want photos of themselves digitized? And did you devise a way early on to surface and address these objections? Great question.
Yes, especially if your family in particular is very large and not necessarily in good communication, because it can be a rude surprise to those that find out belatedly. So yes, like your intuition there on sensitivity and being proactive is right on. For the particular project that I shared, the the fortunate part was that the family previously these last few years had established essentially like a Facebook group for all of the people who happen to be related through that common ancestor. And so there already was a really good dialogue and interest in the history. And in fact, it's probably safe to say that is what helped spur the like, let's do this, like, holistically and get it out there for everybody.
Yes.
Um, for the family members, several of the women that I was working with, and one of them was my mom, she did some great outreach and like heads up or like this is what we're doing, are you interested kind of conversations. So of course that was of tremendous help. So that was for that specific example. But yes, when you're working with family archives, especially if the people are still alive, it is worth checking in with them and even just sharing why you're doing it and how you're making it available. Often just the conversation and offering that information is enough for them in terms of what they need. So yes, I definitely encourage those conversations to happen and to happen before you do the work, because of course you may need to do some troubleshooting or some adjustments depending on what you find.
Excellent advice. Another attendee says, thank you, Rachel, for your awesome presentation. I agree. For your family history project, is there a sense of the project of achieving milestones, and has this been
Mm.
completed or will be a continuous ongoing initiative?
Oh, I love those. So one part was the continuing. What was the first part, Amberly, of the question?
The first part is for your family history project, is there a sense of the project achieving milestones, and has it
Ah,
been completed?
milestones. Okay, thank you. For us and for the family archiving project, even just getting like the first like dozen photographs online and published with the metadata, especially because we started with my great grandmother, was just so emotionally rewarding. I had not seen many of those photographs, and so just the ability for myself and like all of the family involved was so rewarding. So as soon as we would publish a batch, which we would do in like a couple dozen at a time. And each time we would post it to the Facebook group that exists for that family, and people would just go nuts because they're seeing things that either they've never seen or had, decades. So those milestones, especially for the emotional reward, were very valuable for me. As to the question of if it's done, I chuckled because archivist's work is never done.
No.
So job security, but also like
Yeah,
you're never done.
right.
So for that particular project, and also for Astoria, for the grant, the goal was 500 for that one as well. And so we reached 500 for both. They're done for now. But the hope is, of course, that, as time goes on, everything we're doing is eventually history. So we're never going to run out of historical items to put online. So I would say it's never done, but in like the best possible way.
I love what you said about people finding out things that existed with other family members that they never knew existed, because I'm helping a client right now with preservation services as we're building, to learn and do research on how to build this. Have been helping family members, and one of them has 100-year-old album that no one knew existed. And so when I tell all the other family members, they're like, "What?" I'm like, "Yeah, you're going to get a link to see it." And they're like,
Right.
"Oh my gosh, I never would have known that existed if y'all didn't create that and create
Mhm.
that link." And it's such a rewarding feeling.
Mhm.
Here is a question I can relate to. I am a student in an MLIS program, archival track, and I'm interested in the path that led you to create your own archival consulting company.
Um, it is not a short story. And one that I am happy of sharing. I have a webinar and some blog posts on it, so I encourage the person who asked the question and whoever else may want to know the answer, shoot me an email. The slide that's up currently, consulting@rachaelchristine.com. Shoot me an email with that question, and I'll be happy to send you some uh, previously answered and recorded and any other questions that you may have.
Great. How do you provide access to the metadata spreadsheet for all contributors to leverage?
For most of the projects where we've had this approach, Google Drive and using Google Documents has been the easiest to use, both in terms of it seems to be the easiest for non-technically savvy people to be able to figure out and use. It also has the ability to do like that live updating and sharing, even if you don't have like a nicer G Suite account. So that's been the best way we have found. When you are working with family archives, though, there are going to be some people who just like, they just don't do the internet. And so
Yes,
we did
for
do
sure.
some sessions where it was like a phone call and,
Yes.
it takes longer, but it's worth it.
It's so worth it. It's so worth it. I agree with you. And this is one for permanent. Can permanent read automatically metadata fields of digital images, including any user added metadata? We definitely can. Like if you create metadata in another system, it uploads straight to our system and is read automatically with whatever you created or whatever date it was taken and format it will upload. And let's see. Hi, Rachel. Do you have any good ways to convince an institution to use permanent.org as a DAMS program over relying on their computer server system?
Oh my gosh. Um, yes. Being candid and honest about the risks of what will happen eventually is usually a good first start because it is scary. Keeping things on computers as the only copy is very risky. I mean, there equipment failure, natural disasters, like just the last few years alone, I think has given us many reasons as to why things should not just live on the local computer. So yes, whether it's permanent or a different product, like it needs to not be on the computer. It needs to have automated backups. It needs to hopefully have a system sophisticated enough to be doing the checksums and the fixity. Um, so yes, and what I have found people often don't think about as like directors or people in charge of making those decisions is that it's not just that, yes, okay, if you're using permanent or Dropbox or what have you, like, yes, it does cost money and it will take time to figure out and set up. But if you don't do that, and this is what they don't, I think, realize, is once that computer does fail for whatever reason, all of that work that you and everybody else did to digitize those files is gone. So, like, not only do you lose the items themselves, you have just flushed down the toilet whatever money it costs for like you as staff, for the digitization equipment, the time it took. And that cost to me, that is the scariest part. Like losing the stuff, yes, tragic, but the scariest part financially is losing that investment. So that is the angle I would use.
Great. Let's see. There are so many questions, which makes my heart happy. Let's see. This is a copyright. This is a rights question. This is a good question too. Rachel, for the family archive, different family members own different materials, correct? So aren't there technically numerous rights holders in the group? Was this an issue you needed to address?
Yes, um, I would actually take that one step further on the complication scale and say typically copyright is the person who created the item, which would be the photographer for many of these collections that at least we discussed today. In the archives case, by the time things make it to the archives, there usually is transfer of custody, etc. But as you pointed out, for family archives, there's not usually that like transfer of custody. So that is part of why it is so important to have conversations with the larger family, not only in terms of that their image may be online, but also in terms of when you're inviting them to also participate, you are inviting them to join the collaborative effort. And so, as I mentioned, when you put things on permanent, like you, whomever contributed the photo, you still own those rights. And so, it wasn't like they needed to transfer the rights to me or to my client. They still have those rights. They get to decide if they also want to put those images online. So hopefully that answered your question.
I am also a professional photographer, so I love that you said that.
Yep.
Yes, I do. So we have time for one more question and then we're going to sign off. This last question is, how do you tag or what metadata do you include if you have photographs with no date or names?
Mm. This is where subject tagging would probably be the most helpful. And as you get into the work of looking at images and describing them, even if you don't know the names of the people or where it is, you can still describe the scenery, how many people are in the photo, what are they dressed like, what does it look like they're doing in the descriptive part, and then from that choosing some of like subjects and keywords that people could search on to at least get close to subject matter of what they're looking for.
Great. This was so awesome. I just love that I got to be involved with this and to meet you. And I want to say thank you to Thomas Visco also for helping behind the scenes for this webinar and all the hard work he did to put this webinar together. Rachel, you were a pleasure to present with. I just, before we go, wanted to tell you that my email is Amberly, AMBERLY, at permanent.org. If you have any questions about our system, also our support and knowledge base at permanent.org is really incredible. You can reach out to support@permanent.org. And Rachel, any parting words?
Just thank you everybody so much for your time. I obviously have really enjoyed using Permanent, and so I hope that you all are able to get a chance to explore it as well. And just thanks so much to the Permanent team for partnering with me on this and sharing not only best practices, but a way to get collections out there, which is really the best part.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us.